Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Paul. Good evening, all. Make sure everybody's awake. First of all, to thank the organizing committee of this lecture series in the fall for the invitation to speak to you tonight, my first visit to ASU, on the topic of detail design and its relationship to landscape architecture. And I'm actually very interested that you have had that as a topic as part of a conversation at the design school in this particular semester. So to make a start, and to maybe possibly state the obvious, landscape architecture is a discipline that constructively engages in the making and the remaking of landscapes, either through development, regeneration, preservation, or conservation. And this constructive engagement has environmental, social, and expressive aims. Very, very basic stuff to start. The environmental aim is the maintenance and, of course, the enhancement of the biophysical systems operating on a site, any site that is being remade. Such as this slide and the last two slides, a coastal tidal marsh. This is Prince Edward Island off the eastern coast of Canada. The social aim is the accommodation and the framing of a way or ways of life in particular circumstances and geographic locations over periods of time. Here, quite simply, it's a game of cards in the Shanghai waterfront park by Turnscape. And the expressive aim is the shaping of an understanding of the contemporary nature of nature in a specific location. And I want to propose to you this evening that a constructive engagement with these three landscape architectural aims is a poetic practice. Because be they normative or innovative, traditional or disruptive, vegetal or man-made, all acts of detailed design and making are conceived, developed, and executed within design and constructural traditions in landscape architecture. And this is a practice within which the meanings of a landscape design intention are formed and materially realized. And in addition, I'd also note really more a personal agenda of mine that underlies tonight's talk. It's really based on my belief that our main contribution as landscape architects is not the scale at which we build or the scope of work with which we're engaged, but rather the quality of thought and precision of execution that we bring to the practice of landscape design, and to that end, the practice of landscape detail. So, not surprisingly, I've entitled this presentation, The Poetics of Landscape Detail, Seeing, Judging, Thinking. And in it, I'm going to explore the nature of detail as it relates to landscape architecture and the landscape design process. A topic which, you might argue, with the exception of here at ASU, that's been conspicuously absent from most research and lecture venues in recent years. The reason for this absence are several, having to do with the expansive, often ill-defined and ever-changing scope and sense of the subject, the lack of applied research and engagement with it at all levels in design schools, and the continued primacy of the studio as a vehicle for students' design education, which so often stays within conceptual and schematic design at best within 14 weeks. So hope to begin tonight to rectify this lack of engagement by presenting it tonight from three different but interrelated aspects. First, to present a survey of the context and significance of making at the detail scale in contemporary landscape architectural teaching and practice. And here I'd like to briefly comment on a current book project I'm working on, really not surprisingly entitled The Poetics of Landscape Construction. This is the cover design for Routledge that we're working on right now. Second, to outline some general observations and thoughts on the relationship that exists between ideas, between design ideas and making in landscape architecture and detail from both what may be termed traditional landscape projects and types, as well as current innovative and emerging landscape work. And this includes investigations of waterfront parks, water cleansing installations, such as shown here again. This is the Shanghai Hutan Park by Konjen Yu of Turnscape, Beijing, landscape architects. And these observations include the role of technology in design, the pursuit of quality in construction. What do we mean by quality within landscape architecture? And how is it defined? And the transformation of meaning in a completed work. So it's technology in design. What do we mean by that? The pursuit of quality and the transformation of meaning in any work. And then thirdly, I'm going to look at one case study, just one project, example from the contemporary built landscape to see what attitudes, languages, styles of operations we can uncover as being present and active in detailed design. And I'm going to focus on this project, the Seine Yudo Hangang Park in Seoul, South Korea, which was completed in 2002. It's a project that actually is little known in this country, even though it won the SLA Professional Design Award of Merit in 2004. So it has actually been in kind of active use for a considerable period of time, the last 12 years. But again, it's little known. I've spent some time visiting and revisiting this site over the last 8 years, really to work out or to fathom the various design methods, the detail methods here, and to interview the designers and to understand its significance to the local population, socially, environmentally, and culturally. So, my book project, The Poetics of Landscape Construction, uses 3 methodological instruments to engage the existing world and the traditions that shape it. And they're very simple, but they're kind of terms I want to talk about. Seeing, judging, and thinking, which I'd suggest to you is a kind of the core of your design process. First, seeing. Seeing is the act of observation as either a probing searchlight analytically aimed at aspects of the world, or as disinterested curiosity drinking in the infinite disorder of the forms of the natural and the man-made environment. More simply put, form comes from other form, detail comes from other detail. And if you, as students and young practitioners, want to develop your own detailed language, you have to acquire over time a repertoire of forms through observation. I refer to this in my students as either the bucket or the searchlight. In other words, the bucket where you're actually collecting forms and images with no particular use in mind, collecting them for the future, as opposed to the searchlight where you're actually focused very specifically on solving one particular issue, one particular approach. In both cases, these acts of observation aim to build a vocabulary of design form. And the vocabularies of landscape architecture are organized by diagnostic section, within which the 4 concepts of boundary, surface, transition, and landscape object establish categories for organizing these observations. And the primary instrument of observation is analytical studies in either analog, digital, or model forms. And these afford access to the comprehension of the visual and tactile values of landscapes and enables a landscape architect to draw analogies between different observations and to discover appropriate detailed design forms and modes of construction. Judging is the ability to discern and develop the qualities of dimensions, scale, proportions, and refinements in landscape construction. The interrelationship of dimensions, scale, and proportion determine the presence of a landscape detail. And thinking is the working out of a construction detail within the measurable design spaces of parallel and conic projection. into material and experiential reality. Parallel projection, especially isometric space, allows the exploration and development of detail assemblies. And conic projection or perspective affords the carving out of landscape space, the manipulation of projective geometry, notation, and composition in a drawing determines the position of the maker in relationship to the landscape design under development. Now, I want to outline some general observations and thoughts on the relationship that exists between ideas and making in landscape architecture and detailed design. And first, the role of technology. What do we mean by technology in landscape design? Webster's dictionary describes technology as the, quote, entire body of methods and materials by which objectives, particularly industrial or commercial, are met, or, quote, the application of these methods or materials, end of quotes. And derived from the Greek techne, meaning art or craft, its application to the design field is quite recent, starting from the middle of the 19th century. It was applied to all of the so-called practical arts, including engineering, mechanical design, and site construction, such as shown here in these stereo pair photographs of the very early built forms of Central Park, probably from about mid-1860s to about 1870s. It's unclear exactly when they were taken, but probably about that time. Leo Marx, in his essay, Postmodern Pessimism, from this book, Does Technology Drive History?, outlines the usage of the complementary terms used before 1850, before technology, called respectively mechanic arts and fine arts. And he states, quote, the artifacts, the knowledge, and the practices later to be embraced by technology, which is this general term, would continue to be thought of as belonging to a special branch of the arts known as the mechanic, for meaning practical, industrial, or useful, as is distinct from the fine, high, creative, or imaginative arts, which continue to be known as such. Therefore, building a road, a bridge, a park, belong to the mechanic arts. Oil painting and sculpture and architecture, we're told, belong to the fine arts. A plantsman who plans and installs a garden for a client was a mechanic artist. An artist who documented that garden for aesthetic and creative purposes was a fine artist. And he continues, Marx goes on. Quote, ever since antiquity, moreover, the habit of separating the practical and the fine arts has served to ratify a set of overlapping and invidious distinctions between things and ideas, the physical and the mental, the mundane and the ideal, making and thinking. End of quotes. And by extending this line of thought to landscape design, detail, and construction, it's clear that landscape architecture, as we would call it, such as the Emerald Necklace in Boston, shown here also by the Olmsted office, had roots derived from both mechanic and fine arts, as we have previously described. In fact, the strength of the field derived in part from the combination of both, or the juxtaposition of both. This is a fairly early, about 1886, of the Muddy River construction as part of the necklace. It also is very useful and to show that the Emerald Necklace by the Olmsted office was an entirely manufactured and constructed landscape element. It was not natural in any shape or form. It's interesting to note, therefore, in the case of the garden that I made earlier, that the plantsman's skill and work was not considered to have any aesthetic or creative purpose. only the results of the work through another person's eyes, description, appreciation, or recording. Let's move on. The next topic is the pursuit of quality in detailed design. The 20th century English designer Maxwell Fry, based in London, said, quote, "The acceptance of the mediocre as the best life offers is indeed a danger insufficiently recognized," end of quotes. Now, as landscape architects, we are perhaps a little disillusioned about the world sometimes, but still perfectly confident of our mental agility and capacity to create or reconstruct on a large scale a range of projects and expressions over time is shown here. And the process of education has brought us naturally to think in increasing multitudes. To resist this seemingly inevitable progression has proved difficult. We press for blanket solutions in design and have to absorb a huge quantity of new information about changing methods, products, materials, and codes, as well as shifting areas of endeavor, such as, and I'll just name a few, which are on people's lips these days: coastal resilience, land retreat, energy resources, climate change, water scarcity. In the process, an equally large body of expertise has unobtrusively leaked away, has almost vanished. What has gone, I'd suggest to you, is very particular and in some cases unquantifiable information. How to qualify parts of your built work and make them significant. How to do specific things. For example, simple surfaces and transitions. How to make connections and reveal edges. How to make telling junctions. Simply how to turn corners. It's a skill that has almost disappeared. And that information is actually quite difficult to transmit. It depends on a continuous interaction with skilled people of all kinds, and this is quietly evaporated under the impact of linear progress. This is from near Hanover in Germany. It's about a 17th century lane. Now, from even a fragment of an older landscape, and this happens to be one of my favorite ones. This is a Auger photograph of the banks of the Seine. Just look at it. You can stare at this for hours, and the more you look at it, the more you start to learn, and the more you understand, and the more you don't understand. It's incredibly complex geometry. But from a fragment of an older landscape, we receive immense satisfaction and a sense of the continuity of life, I would suggest. In contemporary built landscapes, many of which fail to pass on that same sense, this seems like an unobtainable quest, to make that connection, to find in the particular in the general, and the general in the particular. How can contemporary landscapes be constructed to be experienced by people as full participants rather than as distant observers? And I'd like to propose, by an engagement with the ordinary physical environment found in a place, an investment of quality in the normally overlooked. The detail of the designed landscape, such as shown here in Montmartre, the steps leading up to the Basilica, which were, some of you may remember it, is very famously photographed by Brassai in his Street Views of Paris at Night. Now, this is not attempting to be a fetishism of the mundane, a veneration of bollards and steps, nor is it a plea for a uniform abstract landscape ground. Rather, it is a pursuit, I'm suggesting to you, that seeks to give everything made in the landscape a degree of studied detail and constructional attention. Thirdly, the topic of transformation of meaning in completed work. I just maybe add one thing, going off script to Paul's introduction. While my last 22 years or so have been in academia, before that I was a practicing landscape architect. This is one of the projects I was involved with in the Olin office in Philadelphia. I worked there for about 9 years, working on the Barcelona Olympics in '92, the Bryant Park restoration, the Canary Wharf work in the City of London, and other projects. And so a lot of what I'm saying isn't just lodged in the academy, but comes from the practices we did in the Olin office. I just wanted to be clear about that. But landscape, going back to transformation of meaning, landscape architecture can be considered as materiality embodying ideas. Its presence as built work is a result of the constructive manipulation of the medium of the landscape, a medium composed of simply earth forms, vegetation, and other natural and man-made materials. Design can propose any idea. This is the beauty you have inside the academy. You can propose any idea. You can have 10 ideas while you're just sitting there. But what is important is actually to dispose and transpose these ideas into a precise material form. I often say my mother has landscape ideas, but she has no training to transpose those into built landscapes. So it's about almost weakening the idea or the primacy of the idea to a process where the idea is then resolved in material reality, to have meaning. So landscape design, and more specifically the work of landscape detail, has to embody both the practical and the symbolic dimensions of the man-made landscape. For example, here, this is the Fifth Avenue edge of Central Park, again by Olmsted, a very simple kind of vertical wall device separating the public street from the interior of the park. So this understanding that in landscape architecture, what and how one details, the way we detail design has significance, has led me to accumulate observations of landscape detail forms dictated by ideas and the fundamental conditions of climate, bodily movement, spatial enclosure, and surface manipulation, which in my view constitute the basis of a material reality. These observations illustrate a personal and evolving point of view about the shaping of the landscape. They show, and here I'll be very honest, a certain predilection for what I call an austere clarity, certain things I'm attracted to in terms of built work, and certain things I'm not, based on the belief that the role of physical design in a democracy is to make an open stage for human action. As well, and here again a personal note, in my own background in growing up in Scotland, in Edinburgh, Scotland, a place that is often known for, first of all, its extremely poor climate, practical concerns, and the seamless integration of landscape and architecture, past and present. This is a view of the city center. I'm advocating here not a design philosophy, nor a style. What I find significant and its transformation into a specific landscape expression is open to critical analysis, and you may choose to like it or not. But that critical judgment does not nullify the importance of my topic, which is the observation of the world you find yourselves in the role of detailed design and construction, and how this activity enriches landscape architects pursuing the implications of their own reconstructible experience. This is Bloedel Reserve by Rich Haig. But what are the sources of physical design form in landscape architecture? The answer is other forms, as I've said, physical and virtual, be it high art, low art, or no art at all. A work of landscape detail imaginatively transforms this material within a context shaped by the historically specific dimensions of an individual sensibility, the sensibility of the landscape architect, cultural, social, professional, and economic practices, and the geographic circumstances of a site. And so coming to terms with the meaning of what one finds in a place through the act of landscape detail is not a plea for a slavish adherence to the forms of the past. I will make that very, very clear. No landscape precedent can be appropriated uncritically, and the historical inertia of inherited forms must be overcome by original design investigations. But at the same time, neither can the designer just make a form trusting to the, quote, dark night of the soul, unquote, to transcend the inertia of the tradition and in order to configure a new presence. It must be recognized that any landscape design vocabulary, classical, romantic, modern, postmodern, or resilient, are all inescapably engaged, intentionally or not, with the past and the present, with nature and culture, understood through the histories of art, design, craft, and fabrication. So the following images are part of a documentation of built landscape details I've collected for teaching and research purposes. And from a collection of 40,000 images, I've chosen to focus only on one simple topic. And don't ask me how I organize them. That's a whole other lecture. The movement of water over a built surface. And I want to use this really very singular, but important subject to discuss the relationship that exists between ideas and execution in landscape architecture. Starting very humble. We know we're in the northern hemisphere because water flows down drains clockwise. This is a Parisian drain. In parks in Paris, set into gravel walks, this simple, humble little thing on the right in the foreground collects water and takes it away silently and efficiently. But the metal cover, which is a mass-produced product of the mechanic arts, remember that term, with a little nod to the microflow of water, elevates this ordinary and somewhat invisible activity to something that is hauntingly poetic and locates us both locally in Paris and globally in the northern hemisphere, if you are able to see it. And 99% of people don't see it. Here's a more Puritan way of looking at the same thing. In New England, this is a Yankee detail, if there ever was one. This is Beacon Hill in Boston, an early 19th century stone step. Some of you have seen this. Getting things down in a matter-of-fact way, no more, no less. 3 grooves cut into stone, each getting progressively shallower as you go down, which is curious because you'd expect the exact opposite, that it would get progressively deeper to catch the increasing volume of water. However, this is for the slow drip, drip, drip of November and March. This is for a very slow weathering, wearing climate. Not the raging torrents of southern Europe and Siena, where probably the most famous single drain guards the piazza during violent rainstorms in the summer and collects the water up to 2 feet in depth for very short periods of time. This, in fact, you can lose children down there and they get swept away. It's actually quite deep and it happens extremely fast. It's a landscape detail that can only be understood when it rains. The rest of the time, it's just simply a part of the assembly here. And yes, it's a bounded space, but folded into delicate brick surfaces that tip the water to tight, small urban streams of the more durable stone, which lead down to the single drain. It's not just a pattern in the paving. It's not just part of a plan. It's a didactic surface, demonstrating both the process of moving water and the means by which it can be achieved efficiently, as well as forming a stage for rich and engaged city life, from the annual horse race that happens here to the daily stroll and conversation. In this early article that I published in Landscape Architecture magazine way back, back in the Dark Ages. I set out to define what I consider to be one of the most significant and visible images to be addressed within landscape design in detail, the issue of time, design performance, and failure in the detail of the built environment, and the application of this knowledge back into the profession through the classroom. This article cost me dearly. This is for young academics. I was banned from writing in landscape architecture for 3 years after this, because the editor at the time believed that we should not be writing about things that didn't work or drawing attention to things that were wrong in built work, and it was inappropriate for a professional magazine. Just so you know, I waited it out. She was fired as editor, so just hang in there. This arose from a series of detail walks which I led with my landscape students around the environments of Boston and Cambridge. And it's become apparent with each passing year that the built fabric of many of our contemporary design landscapes at the detail scale are breaking down. And it also seems likely that we're in great danger of repeating the same mistakes, particularly as national landscape projects are repaired, rebuilt, or regrettably demolished, such as Kylie's North Carolina Bank Plaza, which was demolished 10 years ago and only exists now in some drawings and some photographs. And this is in contrast to many of the public spaces from earlier eras, which, while undergoing the continuous evolution and change, which is inevitable, continue to function and delight both by their inherent robustness and quality. So the article in Landscape Architecture magazine, which you can kind of read if you're interested, as an exploratory piece, really asked more questions than gave answers. It was not intended to kind of give answers. It was intended to provoke people. And although it does not take a lot of sense or imagination to recognize that the development of the professions of law, engineering, medicine, and military studies are based on the close examination of what did not work in the past rather than what did. And here I'd rather direct you to the work of Henry Petrowski. He's actually a civil engineer, not that well known in the field, who's developed an academic career on this subject. These are two of probably his better books. To Engineer is Human, the Role of Failure in Successful Design, and Success Through Failure, the Paradox of Design. Again, serving, in most cases, the engineering fields. But from this modest starting point, students were asked to consider more critically the nature of built landscapes through the subject of detailed design, and to start to think about the idea of, for example, suicide detailing, the idea of sacrificing one material for another at specific periods of time. These are the steps of the chapel at Harvard. There's a little story attached to these that my students know, which is quite simply Harvard University, in its wisdom, is always looking to save money. And he thought that these steps, the chapel, were getting worn down by constant use over 150 years. So they had the bright idea of, why don't we dig up the steps and turn them over, and then we'll have a brand new surface. So you probably guess what's going to happen. They dug all the steps up, they turned them over, and guess what? 150 years ago, someone had the same idea. And they were worn on that side. So they had to get new steps. But it's interesting how ideas like this keep coming back every 150 years. So the central focus of my work in construction detail was continued through these book publications, which Paul had mentioned, and an ongoing lecture class, which I still teach, entitled The Art of Landscape Detail, which is still a core requirement in our MLA program. And here many of the issues are brought together in a framework which uses the study of detail as a method of bridging design and construction concerns. Students tackle the subjects of detail processes, failures, studies, workmanship and craft, the language and grammar of historical and contemporary designers. This is actually a stormwater management system being installed at Alewife. This is actually only a year old, 2 years old. The main interests of this subject are laid out in three areas: the role of detail as an art form, the activity of detail as bridging the areas of design and construction, and the examination of site construction processes to be documented and critically discussed. And I draw your attention to this. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a certain amount of published material about the construction and landscape detail, the detail process, either from an operational point of view. This is, in fact, from this book. This is actually a very interesting book. 1916 was a book of how to build a park from scratch. The opening chapter is acquiring the land, how to purchase the land, how to assemble the land, how to survey it, how to drain it, how to grade it, how to install paths, roads, all the way through, including labor rates, day rates for installers, and all the machinery that was needed. It's a remarkable piece of work. No one has done anything better since. 1916, John Wiley, the same publisher I use. William T. Lyle, Park and Park Engineering. Another version was a comparative historical and descriptive information. This is actually from a book written in 1910 by Harwood Frost called The Art of Road Making. And what it's done is actually a comparative study of different forms of road constructional section historically, which is quite easy. And what you're starting to see is as the contemporary road developed, it became thinner and thinner and thinner. The section reduced and reduced to wearing courses, if you compare that to the early Roman roads. And even photographic or documentation to do with material assemblies and techniques. I kind of hunt these images down, particularly trying to work out not so much where it is, but what techniques they're using. There was a time, for example, in North America, particularly on the eastern seaboard, and one case in San Francisco where wood block was actually used as a paving surface to reduce the noise of wagons and carts and horses' hooves. So you actually took wooden blocks, turned them on their side, embedded them in macadam. And if you dig, anytime we go down to Boston and I see construction, I run over because sometimes they dig them up again. They're like 2 feet down now. It's kind of interesting. I want to briefly focus on two thematic elements in detail before really going into the case study. It's the use of the terms continuous versus discontinuous in landscape detail. These terms are of use in starting to critically examine the work of built projects to find commonalities and differences between the ideas of singular landscape elements, such as light poles, sculptural gateways, as we see here. Continuous refers to the idea that a linear consistency in a detailed project is developed as a language, with each detail supporting the next in material form, scale, and assembly, and also complementary meaning. This one, of course, I'm going back. It's actually, it's Olmsted, but it's really called Vaux's detail. In New York, Central Park, as a modest curb, rising from the ground to become a metal seat back, a retaining wall, light base, and finally pergola structure, all within about 20 feet, while changing in texture, quality of finish, and applied, in this case, iconographical markings. Abstract grasses and plants of the United States are embedded in this, if you look for it. It's really a set piece where each part is playing a particular role here. And this is in comparison to, say, discontinuous, where each part, each element is treated on its own merits, with its own set of conditions, materials, assemblies, forms, color even. And this example, of course, this is landscape architect Peter Walker from a selection of Solano, which is the IBM headquarters, which shows really this tendency. And detail styles and languages develop in and over time and social space. Again, the same landscape architect, Peter Walker, at the Tanner Fountain at Harvard. And designers inherit them in terms of language and style, knowingly or unknowingly, when they engage in a practice of landscape design and making. And there's, in my estimation, 3 categories of current landscape style and expression, 2014. What you may refer to as the naturalistic. This is, of course, the High Line in New York by James Corner Field Operations, proposes that physical manifestations of nature and natural processes can be stylized within a formal vocabulary for a complex of environmental, social, expressive ends. And these ends can range from the creation of a strictly performative natural system to an evocation of natural scenery, which I propose is really shown here. This is natural scenery. The geometric, which includes all forms of geometric armatures, sets up as a stylistic distinction between the made and the natural. This is the West Seoul Lake Park in Seoul, South Korea. And this distinction occurs within the social and expressive dimensions of landscape architecture, but the resultant configurations also contribute to the environmental performance of the landscape in measurable ways. And then the third, which you can imagine combines both of these, which could be called collage, in the juxtaposition of discrete stylistic vocabularies found both in the naturalistic and the geometric into new or novel heterogeneous configurations. And probably a designer and a colleague who carries out this most is probably landscape architect Michael van Valkenburg. His office is in Cambridge and New York. This is Teardrop Park, Battery Park City, New York. And such landscapes formally cohere by the adjacency of separate elements that retain their specific vocabularies and syntax. And he's done many of his more recent works. The work at the Children's Museum in Boston is a collaging of different parts and pieces, actually not only from other places, but actually from his own career, which he's doing it for particular effect. So I want to talk now about just one project. It's not my project, it's just a project I've been looking at for some time. And in the case study of Seine. There we go. It was started about year 2000, 2001, 2002, that's the period in there. And it displays really all of these categories of detail, style, and expression in one project based on its context, its history, and the projective uses of the site in the future. So I'll give you a little bit of background information about it. Seine lies in the mainstream of the Han River. The Han River, which runs through Seoul, the capital city of South Korea, with approximately 12 million population. It's a rocky outcrop, or was a rocky outcrop on the riverbank, and historically poets and philosophers used it in the 18th century as a site for rest, contemplation, and inspiration, and was actually depicted as such in drawings and paintings such as this. And so the peaks, rocks, and boulders contributed to shore up the river embankment, but sand at its base was hollowed out for use in a nearby airport project. There's a Gimpo Airport, the smaller airport before Incheon was built. And so continued quarrying led to its separation from the riverbank. So it came from being on the bank, it actually became an island in the river and was renamed Seine Island. That's the kind of bank of it these days. For 20 years, it was the location of a municipal sewage treatment plant. Stories always go like this. It always finds some particular use within the city. Until in 2000, the metropolitan government of Seoul decided to convert the island into a park, a landscape park, which you might think is rather visionary, as part of its New Seoul initiative. This aimed to create more green parks and leisure spaces and to provide more cultural programming for the citizens of Seoul. This shows the kind of before and after. At the onset of Korean modernity in the latter half of the 20th century, implementing an adequate and carefully thought out garden park or green space system in Seoul was not considered a priority. Amid pressing efforts to recover from the 50-53 war, the Korean War, and to achieve self-determination and economic prosperity. And later, starting in the 1990s and 2000, the opposing forces of land scarcity and soaring social needs for a higher quality of life, of urban life, forced Korean landscape architects to be especially innovative in the design and detail resolution of landscapes as they repaired, renewed, and recovered a range of wastewater treatment plants, city landfills, and riverfront sites, because these were really the only sites that were actually left or available. And this spawned a new types of gardens and parks in reclaimed post-industrial territory. In this case, the conversion and redesign of the former sewage treatment plant. So the site, here's probably the only plan I'll show tonight, covers 22 acres. You can see the structure of the wastewater treatment plant, but what they did as part of the design was actually to bring water in from the river and through a series of descending pools, treatment, and filtration areas to actually cleanse the water before putting it back in. So on one hand, it actually had a very specific engineering purpose, in addition as part of the park. And it incorporated the industrial landmarks. In fact, the previous slide, the work actually left much of the existing infrastructure, but broke it down in a very particular way. This was not just contractors kind of going in with jackhammers and just whacking away at stuff. It was very precise, the way they started to kind of dismantle certain things and leave other things was quite deliberate as a kind of act of detailed design. And then on top, they laid a new landscape, a landscape of movement and circulation. It contains 4 ecological zones and 7 key facilities. The landscape detail process addressed in the project are concerned with these activities: removal, editing, repair, modification, and additions. But the additions are usually fairly small scale. So the first zone converts the former water purification basin into a series of inherited geometric pools. Natural filtration processes are now used to clean the river water, and each basin contains different plant species that can be seen from low-lying walkways, allowing children and adults to get quite close, actually very close to the plant life. But you can see straight away that in terms of the kind of ordering of the geometry, they inherit the wastewater treatment plant geometry. But in doing so, by laying a new layer of detail on top, they're able to bring quite a different aesthetic, one that talks about public as opposed to private, working as opposed to observation. And so you walk through this place. It's quite magical. This place is called the Garden of Green Columns. It contains rows of ivy-clad columns, formerly the main reservoir's foundations, and used here as a collage. So again, we're using collaging here, of past elements to shape a new civic space. Amid, again, geometric shallow filtration basins, we're walking along the site, previously used to remove debris from the water, have now become an aquatic botanical garden. And this contains a variety of native Korean plant species. And a garden of transition, or rest, another former, it's a chemical settlement facility that houses a naturalistic aroma garden, a vine garden, moss garden, and a fern garden within the public park. Now these are all very well, but what really is important is to see that the 4 zones, all these zones are connected with other public facilities by a maze of paths, boardwalks, elevated walkways that run alongside, through, under, between a network of pipelines and water conduits. And they actually include a 200-seat amphitheater, an exhibition hall with an exhibition about the river, and traditional Korean pavilion that looks out over the river's northern banks. And what is most important is the way the designers bring out original elements of the structures, the detail of the structures, and the value given to both naturalistic detail and geometric materiality as more critical than the preservation of existing systems. So the park's site design quality, that term again, comes from particular smaller scale rooms and scenes rather than the sequential experience of this landscape. And really a very detailed approach that relies on the presence of the former walls, floors of the treatment plant while inserting visible ecological processes and social programs. It's quite a magical place. I've been there so many times, and it changes its mood, almost like an English park, depending on when you go, what time of year you go. So in this park, by the Landscape Architectural Office of COAN, Total Landscape of Seoul, they have to be recognized as really, really premier designers. The most powerful elements of this reclaimed site are the scenic subterranean wild gardens, where seeping water and vines come together and entangle with the deteriorated walls and the sunken level of the former chambers and tanks. And there's our garden of green columns. And of course, they have to leave one in the middle, which has no ivy on it. The experiential quality of the surfaces transcends the inconvenience of the existing infrastructures. By inconvenience, they cut through it, they lop parts of it off, they work their way through it. By reusing and renovating the existing site where unexpected and unprecedented gardens and park spaces are created, and the detailed design takes account of the existing weathered concrete and the introduced gravel paths and walkways. So in summary, what is new in the style of this landscape architecture is really the reinvigoration of the old. The legitimacy of this process is measured against the contemporary needs that require different forms of landscape to address environmental and social issues, and a desire to express these needs in reinvigorated forms. Not that this should be any test, but in 2011, one of my former students, Lena Cho, was married here. So the idea that this now has become a place where you get married, which is quite an interesting thought in a post-industrial ruin. So I believe that landscape architects are concerned ultimately in our work with what you may call head, heart, and hands. Really from the head, finding out, understanding, organizing, and structuring. From the heart, the creative art, the knowing, the feeling, and the giving. And the hands, the putting together, the sensing of materials, whether living or inert, the pleasure of making and of a thing well made. And thus, we bring together all our human faculties. The traditional process of design by observation, by imitation, and by development, or by seeing, judging, and thinking, has been eroded today by the compulsions and the desires to be continuously original. Has been eroded today by the desires to be continuously original. And by the decay or the decline of landscape detail, rather than the decay of the materials themselves and the making, remaking, and preservation of our landscapes. We must accept building as our bedrock, know it inside and out, be dissatisfied with the meanness of our minimum standards. We have to look again at what is called traditional or tradition, for we are continually harping on about what is different in our time to such an extent that we have lost touch with what is not different, what is essentially the same. Now, of course, we have to work at a level at which we are employed, but should pay regard to lesser and greater magnitudes of scale. We ought to search for the general in the particular and particularize the general. And we should aim to clarify the nature of our tasks and determine the importance as well as the relative value of their parts. Yet this is still a minority view in the profession, perhaps because it takes time and patience. Landscape architecture as a profession, an academic discipline, and a series of complex and interrelated planning and design practices still has little understanding and therefore by association, scant documentation of how our built landscapes change. We kind of now know the forces, some of the forces that bring about this change and the many forms it takes even post-Sandy and post-Katrina. I particularly like the one at the top right, just to show you this is Hoboken waterfront that just got wiped out by Sandy. And how can this important phenomena be addressed here in a design school in both a descriptive and a prescriptive manner? We're told that the Greeks were too sensible to think in terms of either or. With them it was not only but also. So not only function, but also form, not only structure, but also expression of structure, not only use, but also significance, and so on. And this is a kind of a nice game you can play, which perhaps points a moral. Our failure to see the problem because we're already in love with the answer. And art, as well as science and technology, will find you out. So we must, on an individual basis, confront that duality of our activity, poetics and pragmatics together as a whole. And I'd suggest to you tonight that in the work of landscape detail, you can find a potentially fertile place for you to both start and project your design work and research. Now, for all the current landscape architecture students in the audience, I have some instructions for you in the hope that your stay here in the department will be productive, enriching, and a trajectory towards meaningful landscape practice in all its many forms. So this is just for you, okay? Now, these instructions about the details of landscapes that are actually adapted from a talk presented to students as part of the Charles Eliot Norton Lectures at Harvard in 1956 by the artist Ben Shahn. Not a particularly well-known artist now, but significant at the time. And I'm going to quote from this. While you are here, he is addressing the students in Memorial Hall, quote, "There is no content of knowledge that is not pertinent to the work you will want to do. Visit and observe landscapes and more places than you can hope to visit. Work at something for a while. Do anything. Get a job in a potato field or work in an auto repair shop. If you do work in a field, do not fail to observe the look and feel of the earth and of all things that you handle, including machines and hand tools. Listen well to conversations and be instructed by them, and take all seriousness seriously." Kind of like that. Know all you can, curricular and non-curricular. Visit every type of landscape, every type of constructed space, and do not spurn the mundane, or the derelict, or the wistful, or the difficult. Talk and discuss and argue among yourselves daily. Listen to everything. Now, this is the bit that definitely ages. Listen to Mahler, Stravinsky, Billie Holiday, and John Coltrane, but you can fill in who you want to in that period. Listen to preachers in the Harvard Memorial Church on Sundays. Listen to the citizens and selectmen in New England town meetings, and brackets. Now, there's an education. Go to all sorts of parks, gardens, museums, and galleries. Walk the banks of the Charles River. Stand alone in Harvard Yard at night, as well as the bridges over the Fort Point Channel. Draw, 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 and learn to work. Know all you can about landscape architecture, and by all means have many opinions. Never be afraid to become embroiled in design arguments, or life, or politics. Never be afraid to learn to design better than you already do. And never be afraid to undertake any kind of landscape proposal, however exalted or however common, but do it with distinction. End of quotes. Thank you for your attention.